I'd like to introduce everybody to another project that I had started many years ago. This one's actually 15 years in the making versus the Catholic Dads podcast, which was 4 years in the making. But my grandmother, back in 2002, grandmother Nettie Denton, she gave me these books. Not just books, she gave me a container box full of writings, photographs, letters, cards from a priest that she had befriended in the parish in Sulphur, Louisiana, way back in the day. Father Veillard was his name, and Father Veillard was a family friend of my grandmother and my mom, and all of them growing, as their family was not to say growing up, but while they were in Sulphur, Father Veillard was at the parish, and I can't remember what Grandma's job was at the parish. I think she actually did some secretarial work or something like that. But anyway, it came with a lot of books of sermons. And when I say a lot of books, there were seven books. And in these books there was handwritten sermons, and they were amazing. His handwriting was just like spot on calligraphy. His penmanship was just immaculate. You could tell this guy was, a very impeccable priest. Probably a stereotypical priest you would think of from the 60s or 50s or whatever. Anyway, she had actually started writing something about it. I think she had intended to make a book out of it. And one day she gave me all of these. And so I decided to pick up the torch, and I was going to write it. And inspired by, she had written a book called Go Back for the Laughter. It was about her childhood growing up. My mom helped her write the book. So my mom kind of interviewed her, and she just told stories, and Mom compiled those, and they published that. And I was like, hey, if my grandmother and mother could publish a book, I can publish a book. So I get these 7 composition books, and I start typing them. And I don't know how long it took to type them, but it was an amazing journey, because as I'm typing these books, these sermons, I'm being basically exposed to, I can't remember how many, I'd have to go back and count them, but I'm being exposed to all of these sermons. It's like going to Sunday Mass and getting the sermon. So it was really an amazing process, and I learned a lot, and I felt close to the Spirit, and then I was done, and then it was like, well, now I got to proofread it all, and now I got to make sure that there's no errors in the text, and make sure I cross-reference everything, because who's going to publish a book that's not really, done all that stuff? And that's about where it stopped. So, but anyway, I've got it written up in book form. I had it printed out at Kinko's at one point in time, and bound, in a spiral bound thing. And that was what I was going to bring to and call it To the Throne of God, because that's what my grandmother was going to call her book on this. But now inspired with the podcast idea, that I can maybe have this platform to let the world see, or let whoever wants to hear these sermons, this could be a great opportunity for that. So I'm going to go ahead and start recording these, and I will be releasing them periodically on the Catholic Dads podcast page, and we'll see how it goes. So this is the foreword that my grandmother had written. I have no idea what year she wrote this, but it was clear that she was going to actually write a book using these sermons. It says, the Reverend Father, the Reverend Father Eugene C. Veillard. The C stands for Camille, by the way. Eugene C. Veillard, MS, he's a missionary of La Salette. That's what the MS stands for. The Reverend Father Eugene C. Veillard, MS, was no ordinary man, nor was he an ordinary priest. He made complete use of the brilliant mind endowed him by his Creator. His compassion for the neighbor consumed him completely, making him the perfect instrument of the will of God. This compassion in him had been kindled in his childhood by his deep love for Our Lady of La Salette, the mother of our Lord Jesus. Father Veillard fulfilled the role for which he was created. He fulfilled the utmost perfection. He fulfilled with the utmost perfection what many are called for, but which only few are chosen. He prayed, he sacrificed, he admonished, he demanded, he gave, he cried, he loved. He walked the roads of the world, not in shoes seen by men, but in the sandals of Christ, not in clothes seen by men, but in the robes lined with the stings of ants, not with a strong, healthy back, but one weakened and broken by the heavy weight of a cancerous cross, not with the love of all he loved so much, but with lashes of indifference and resentment from the many who defiled the peels, from the many who defied the pearls he offered. He pledged his love and his life to help dry the tears of his sorrowful mother of La Salette. He fulfilled her command, "Go, my child, go, my missionary, go make known to all my people my sad message." He heard her loving voice calling to him, and he knew immediately that no earthly power could stop him from obeying her every command. The love he was to receive from that day forward could never be put into words. The sacrifices he made and the hardships he sustained only strengthened his love and devotion to the Blessed Mother, divine love. As he fulfilled a lifetime of bringing hope to the hopeless, love to the loveless, and peace of God to all men of good will. Such was the life of Eugene Camille Veillard, missionary of La Salette, faithful son of Mary. Make our lives those of prayer, holy, humble, penitent, believing, earnest and persevering prayer that rises straight to the throne of God and comes back to us in the form of grace, wisdom, fortitude, and courage. So did he live all the days of his life. So did he teach and exhort all who had been privileged to hear him, to see him, to know him. The contents of this book contains the works and prayers of Father Eugene Camille Veillard, missionary of La Salette, beloved priest, counselor, and friend of all people. For we who knew him personally, the pain of losing him is intense. But by his passing from among us, we are now challenged to continue on as living proof that his sweat and toil to teach us to know God and to enjoy his gifts in this world had not been in vain. May his most fervent wish be fulfilled. May these, my feeble words, inspire some young men or boys in this parish with a desire to become missionaries of La Salette, who will zealously work for the salvation of souls by making known to the whole world the divine message of Our Lady of La Salette. And that was my grandmother. It was written in 1960 in Sulphur, Louisiana. And this is what I had intended to put down as the foreword for myself. This book is the result of a grand orchestra that was set in motion by the great composer of the universe 1 century ago. It began in 1902 when Father Veillard put pen to paper and filled 7 composition books with sermons from which he would preach his homilies at Sunday Mass. 50 years later, when he was the pastor of Our Lady of Prompt Secours in Sulphur, Louisiana, my grandmother, Nettie Denton, approached Father Veillard to ask if he could use some help with secretarial work, and he graciously accepted. On November 20th, 1960, After a decade of friendship with my grandparents, Father Veillard passed away, leaving some of his personal belongings with my grandmother. After viewing the contents of the package, my grandmother stored it away for safekeeping, unsure what to do with the contents. Then one day in 2002, she told me that she had something she wanted to give me. After 40 years of storage, she felt that it was meant for me to have the contents of Father Veillard's package. I eagerly accepted and spent a whole day poring over its contents. Photographs, postcards, greeting cards from friends and family showed just how much this holy man of God was loved and respected by those with whom he came in contact. Ledgers containing the names of every person who sent him a card or any donation, cross-referenced with a legend indicating if he replied in writing or in person, showed that he was a very meticulous and organized man. However, the crown jewel of the box was his 7 composition books containing sermons on topics ranging from blasphemy to vocations. The age of the books, coupled with the sheer beauty of his calligraphy and handwriting, made it seem as though I was handling fine works of art rather than priestly composition books. I liken the experience to finding a treasure chest filled with riches beyond compare. I immediately began the task of typing the sermons to preserve their timeless messages, but it quickly became evident that these words must not only be preserved, but also proclaimed. I pray that through the words of Father Veillard, we might all come to know and love Jesus Christ more deeply. And that was October 12th, 2003. And today is October 6th, 2017. Prologue. An obituary. It was early in November, and the pale autumn sun was going down across Lake Charles when a visitor stopped at St. Patrick's Hospital to see for the last time a priest whom he had known and with whom he had lived for several years. The sick man was pale and almost constant pain, and so weakened from his long illness that he could scarcely rise from his chair. It was evident that this once exceptionally healthy little man, Father Eugene Veillard, was dying of internal cancer. And none knew it better than the patient himself, for Father had remarked to several of his friends visiting that he was under no illusions, that God wanted it that way, and that his time had come to leave this world. Cardinal Newman once said that one of the marks of a gentleman is to submit calmly to death, it being our inevitable destiny. To die peacefully is above all, with God's grace, a Christian virtue. Eugene Camille Veillard was born on the 26th of February, 1883, in the town of Châteauneuf, in the ancient province of Savoie in southern France. He was the third of 10 children born to Charles Veillard and Marie Nicolette. Like many other country boys of France in those days, Eugene attended the government school of Coise between the years of 1888 and 1894. Those were the days before Pope St. Pius X, and it was noteworthy that it was only to the end of this period, at the age of 11 years, that this future missionary was admitted to his first Holy Communion. In the fall of the same year, September 24th, 1894, Eugene Veillard was admitted to the Apostolic School of the Missionaries of La Salette in Grenoble. Going home for vacation in those days was not like going home for our American seminaries of today. And in this respect, Father Veillard, in later years, loved to tell the story of his first return home and seeing for the first time his little brother Auguste. This same Auguste followed his brother into the congregation of Our Lady of La Salette and is today the vice provincial of the mission of Antistrab in the island of Madagascar. The first years of Father Veillard's religious life were spent at the novitiate in the holy mountain of La Salette, the scene of the apparition and the birth of the congregation. After pronouncing his first religious vows in June of 1899, the young student began his travels that were to take him far and were to end many years later, far from home and family. At the turn of the century, when he was about the age of a senior in high school, Eugene Veillard left home and fatherland, and in the company of other young French students, immigrated to the United States. Those of us who are born and raised in the midst of the comforts and abundance of the United States of America, where it's custom to go home from the seminary at least twice a year to visit the family, are apt to overlook the fact that what these young men then did called for great courage, and personal sacrifice. They were not necessarily as delighted to come to the United States as we are to remain in it. They were leaving home and family and would seldom, if ever, see them again. The sight of New York Harbor is not the most picturesque of sights, even to the returning native. And speaking of this, Father Veillard, later in his own life, admitted that he felt in those early days like the frightened young Joseph going down into strange and vast land of Egypt. From New York, the young scholastics proceeded to Hartford, Connecticut, where in the recently established residence there they pursued their ecclesiastical studies in the congregation. And from Hartford they went to Stansted, Canada for a final year. On June 29, 1905, at the age of 22, by virtue of a very special dispensation from the Holy See, Brother Eugene Veillard was ordained priest in Hartford, Connecticut, by Bishop Michael Tierney. Anointed at so early an age, any priest may look forward to an eventful and varied life in the ministry. For the next 15 years, Father Veillard was attached to the Preparatory College in Hartford, where he taught the classics, cared for the material needs of the residents as treasurer, and in 1910 founded and edited the La Salette Missionary, the predecessor to Our Lady's Missionary. It was in 1920 that he went to Brazil, where the missionaries of La Salette were trying to recover from the ravages brought on by the combined tragedies of World War I and the Spanish influenza. He spent several months in the poor section of Rio de Janeiro, known as Catumbi, and another 6 months in Sao Paulo. Those who were with him 12 years later found the memory of him still alive. As elsewhere, there too he was known as a man of meticulous order and neatness, qualities that characterized him right to the last. Upon his return to the United States a year later, Father Veillard joined the first missionaries of La Salette when they began their now thriving apostolate in the Deep South. When Bishop Jean-Mar of Lafayette confided the parish of Sulphur to the congregation in 1921, Fathers John Ramel and Eugene Veillard were the first to take up residence there. In this extensive parish, from the Calcasieu to the Sabine, and from the Diocese of Alexandria to the great sea marshes of the Gulf, the work of a priest in that vast rural territory was rugged but interesting, tiresome but rewarding, and it was during those years that Father Veillard acquired an attachment to Southwest Louisiana that he never lost. After the General Chapter of 1926, he was appointed Master of Novices in Bloomfield, Connecticut. Now, those who knew him well agree that this assignment was by no means the choosing of the young master. He had come to know the uncultivated vineyard of Sulphur, Shoe Peak, and the pine-clad hills around DeRidder. He had learned that there was a strange and comforting feeling that goes with the quest of the lost sheep through the wilderness and along the bayous. But his work was in the novitiate, and once more we say that those who knew the man admit that he set about his task with the customary seriousness and systematic approach. He impressed upon the novices that the novitiate was a period of time during which they had to learn all about and actually live the religious life, that which was to be theirs for the rest of their earthly existence. To this end, The master insisted upon the daily conferences concerning the rule of the congregation, and set about to furnish a translation into English so that future religious under his care would be better acquainted with their duties and obligations. For him, as his novices, this year of trial was one of strict observance, rather than a time of harassment and endurance. Sincere man that he was, he never attempted to give any other impression. In 1928, at the invitation of the Bishop of Galveston, Texas, the La Salette Fathers assumed the care of the parish of Lufkin in the picturesque country of East Texas. In that same year, Father Veillard was sent to Texas as pastor of Lufkin, and thus became the first La Salette Father to take an assignment in Texas. Through those forests, in the small towns, the Catholic population was very small and scattered. And in those meager days, few were rich and very many were poor. I arrived there practically penniless, Father once said, and I had to wait until the following Sunday collection to buy anything. But in spite of it all, it was during those years that the church in Crockett was built. After 7 years in Texas, Father Veillard returned to Sulphur, and this time was pastor of a parish where he had begun his ministry in Louisiana. Although this assignment lasted only the 2 years from 1935 to 1937, the one outstanding achievement during this time was the opening of the mission in Westlake and the construction of the church. Westlake today is a thriving parish with a fine modern church. During the next year, Father Veillard was superior of the International Scholasticate in Rome. In 1938, he returned again to Louisiana, and this time to remain there. He assumed the charge of the parish of Golden Meadow on Bayou Lafourche in the Archdiocese of New Orleans. Once more, his beloved Louisiana, he had set his hand and mind to work. Among the real necessities was a decent house for the priests, and within the next few years there was built one of the best rectories among us in the South. Also, not far from the town, a chapel was built for a settlement of Indians, long lost and stray remnants of the once famous Sabines. 9 years later, in 1947, Father Veillard became pastor of Loreauville, Louisiana, a quaint old town in the Evangeline country along Bayou Teche. There, a few miles east of town, on the levee that holds back floodwaters of the Atchafalaya River, a poor community of fishermen had settled. This place had come to be known as Bayou Benoit. During the following year, a small chapel was built there, and the mission of Our Lady of La Salette opened. Also during this time, the mission church of Our Lady of Victory, a chapel especially furnished for the colored of Loreauville, was opened. This poor little wooden structure, dilapidated and forlorn, had been purchased many years before in a neighboring town and had been moved in and assembled only a few hundred yards from the parish church. It had been closed later because of a shortage of priests. But seeing that many of the colored were losing the faith, Father Veillard once more opened the mission for regular Sunday Mass and instruction. Again in 1949, at the request of Bishop Jean Mar, Father Veillard was appointed pastor of the Sulphur Parish, and it was in this era that he was to spend the remaining years of his life. The Sulphur of 1949 was quite different from the Sulphur of 1921. During the past quarter of a century, the mines from which the town took its name had shut down, and the lumber mills had moved away. Instead of all this were oil fields for miles around, huge new refineries and chemical plants springing out of the hayfields along the west bank of the Calcasieu. The old town was growing, and the number of new and young families moving in was astonishing. The parish church was far too small. There was need for a parochial school, and the missions needed new churches and improvements on the old ones. The question was once asked, if a picture were taken of a man every day of his life, from infancy to the hour of his death, which one of all those pictures would be most representative of the man? Surely it would not be the first, and in most cases it would not be the last. The question has not been answered, but we feel it would be safe to say that the picture most representative would be the one taken at the man's greatest achievements. And that is why we think here that the best picture of Father Veillard is the one that shows him during these last years from 1949 to to 1956. It was during these years that he made the last and greatest impression on the faithful. Some loved him for his devotion to duty and almost blind loyalty to his friends. Others disliked him for his intransigence and those errors by which even the best of men make. But what priest can be faithful to his duty and still be loved by all? The thousands that gathered around his grave on the day of his burial bore testimony to the mark that he had left upon them. In 1950, the church in Sulphur was remodeled and enlarged to twice its capacity. The following year, a church was built in the mission of Maplewood, a settlement that had come to existence as a result of the industrial growth in this part of the country. Extensive improvements on the church and hall were made in Hackberry, oldest of all of Sulphur's missions. Then an 8-room parochial school was built on the east side of Sulphur, and in this was realized one of the most difficult and expensive undertakings in any parish, but undoubtedly the most productive. Father Veillard was an energetic and meticulous man. And as we look back over these years in Sulphur, we just have to recall some particulars that are sometimes admirable, sometimes amusing. He was a slight man with a feeble voice, always beset with an annoying cough that interrupted his speech in a tantalizing manner. Yet he always officiated at night prayer in the church, almost jealously disdaining the help of assistant priests in the function which he considered his own. Though an early riser himself, he was careful not to disturb the others before the regular time, except on Sunday, when, much to the exasperation of the citizens of the town, he insisted upon ringing the church bells at the outrageous hour of 4:30 in the morning. He insisted, and rightly so, that those who lived be present for morning and evening prayer, and that parish work be taken seriously and all things done on schedule. Though frugal in his own habits, no assistant ever wanted the necessities of life. If you need it, get it, was his answer to any reasonable request. Never did he require of others that which he would not do himself. Indeed, he often went beyond the call of duty. An example of this was rather unheard of an annual custom in providing green branches for Palm Sunday. On the Monday after Passion Sunday, or the first fair day if the weather upset the plans, Father Veillard would put on his rubber boots, take a special knife for the occasion, and set out for the swamps just north of Westlake, and there gathered the palms for Palm Sunday. Anyone who accompanied him on such errands, slipping in the mud, over fallen logs, and through the undergrowth, must agree that he showed the endurance and ability that one would never expect to find in this small, pale man of 70 years. He said that he wanted to do this for the parishioners. How many of them that carried home their little branch of blessed palm each year knew how they got it? Father Veillard loved Louisiana. He knew its people, knew its customs, and made them his own through the 30-odd years that he spent there. He always had some strange tale to tell about it, or an accounting of some particular custom. For this reason, it seemed quite fitting it would be Sulphur that he would observe his 50th anniversary of priesthood. This opportunity presented itself on June 29th, 1955. When the people of Sulphur and surrounding communities gathered to join the pastor in giving thanks to Almighty God for granting him 50 years of blessed ministry, an opportunity not given to most priests, there were 3 generations with him. Grandfathers who had known the dusty town of Sulphur just after the First World War, when it was a little more than a station in the main line of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Fathers who were schoolboys during the bleak Depression days of the 1930s, and boys who knew only the lush abundance of the Sulphur of the prosperity of the 1950s. Father Veillard knew most of them, knew all these times in Sulphur, and could look back with a feeling of gratitude to the fact that God had blessed him with a fruitful ministry through all these varied and troubled years. But it was looking back, and there was a note of farewell in all of this. For only a few months later, the Jubilarian was to gather up the memories of 50 years and move northward to the little town of De Quincy, where he had been appointed pastor. In 1921, Father Veillard had been the priest to recite the first Mass in this place when it was a mission of Sulphur, and now in 1956 he returned as the first pastor. One of the last of his outstanding accomplishments, even when the infirmaries of old age were becoming ever more burdensome, was to establish the mission of Ragley and there build a church. It was now the evening of life, and the shadows were long across the way. Shortly after going to De Quincey, Father Veillard began to feel ill. He was alone, but in spite of his sickness, he carried on bravely, often attending 2 missions beside the parish church. This, for an old man in his 70s, is remarkable and especially worthy of note for many young and healthy men. After undergoing surgery at St. Patrick's Hospital in Lake Charles, it was discovered that he was suffering from malignant cancer, from which recovering could not be expected. Still, he returned to his parish, and even though he was now ably assisted, he insisted upon doing more than his share of work. Thus he continued until the summer of 1960, when he became too weak to recite daily Mass. 55 years ago, the missionary who for the first time went to the altar and said, "I will go to the altar of God, who gives joy to my youth," now bowed his head and said the final prayer, "May the tribute of my worship be pleasing to Thee, O Holy Trinity, and grant that the sacrifice which I, all unworthy, have offered in the presence of Thy Majesty may be acceptable to Thee, and through Thy mercy obtain forgiveness for me and for all those for whom I have offered it." He had said his last Mass. In October, it became evident that the end was approaching. Father Veillard acquiesced to the wishes of his doctor and returned to St. Patrick's Hospital, resigned to the fact that he probably would not leave it. On November 13th, he was given his last sacraments and prepared for his agony. For a week he lingered, and on the afternoon of the following Sunday, November 20th, he answered to the last call of his Master, as he had done so often through his life, and left this world confident in the mercy of the Redeemer he had served so well. After a massive requiem in his parish church of De Quincey, followed by the funeral mass sung by the Most Reverend Bishop in the church at Sulphur, the mortal remains of Father Veillard were taken for burial in a section of Mimosa Pine Cemetery reserved for the missionaries of La Salette. There in the land of southwest Louisiana, where the rolling fields leave the pine lands and the moss-draped oaks stretch to meet the great sea marshes along the Gulf of Mexico, there on the land that he loved and made his own, far from his native France and the loved ones he had left behind, Father Veillard was laid to rest, there to await the judgment day. As he was so often first in life, once more in death, it was given him to be the first. For Father Veillard is the first of the missionaries of La Salette to be buried in the Mimosa Pine Cemetery in Sulphur. With the church, we breathe a prayer over the final resting place, entrust it to the care of Thy holy angels, and set free from all the chains of sin the soul of him whose body lies buried here, so that with all Thy saints he may rejoice in Thee forever. Rest in peace. This obituary was written by the La Salette Fathers in November of 1960, St. Louis, Missouri.